of business. It's an incredibly exciting episode of Detonation because we actually have one of the USTP leadership team here. I love the USTP leadership team because they volunteer their time, their effort, their sweat, their equity, their everything to help the USTP be as good as it is and to go forward into the future of progress and transhumanist dreams and make those dreams become reality. And that's what we're aiming for here, because we're also mainstreaming transhumanism. That's our other logo that we have. Anyway, so we've got Mr. Vahanian here. You can introduce yourself to the audience. You're a fan of Detonation. I appreciate that. I appreciate all the support I can get on here. Because we're trying hard and we're doing what we can. But the USTP is our home, and I thank you very much for participating in that endeavor. How are you? How's your life going at the moment?
Great, mate. And well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your amazing support. It's really very much appreciated, and it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here. Very, very excited about today and the topics we'll be discussing, and overall doing great. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, not an issue at all, and it's really great. And if you like it that much, hopefully you can become on a regular roster, so that we can do this all the time. Come and participate in panels, because we have panel discussions. We can get neuroscientists on. You're interested in neurology, in cognitive enhancement, in cognitive biology. So this is a fun topic, and we enjoy this topic. And Ben Zion 2020, who we're stumping for at the moment in this presidential election cycle, he wants to become the first person to get Neuralace. He wants to go into that as patient zero. What about you? Would you do anything as crazy as that? I mean, would you jump into the Neuralace thing?
Well, that's a really good question. I think a lot of the technologies that we now take for granted at one point were considered crazy, right? Something like a pacemaker. Back in the day, who could have imagined technologies like these, right? And so I think that I would be interested in anything that would result in pushing the human race forward, improving the human condition, as it were. And I am generally in favor of any technologies that improve the human condition, whether it's related to curing disease, whether it's related to slowing down or reversing aging. In essence, anything that makes life even better living than it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about artificial intelligence. We talk about robotics. We talk about blockchain. We talk about VR. We talk about 3D printing. We talk about quantum computing. We talk about biotechnology. We talk about nanotechnology. We talk about automation. We talk about health span. We talk about singularity. We talk about multiplanetary civilizations and distributed centralized networks, security policy, open source, scientific method, and equality all the time here on this show, because that's the key, and that's the core of what we're trying to do here with transhumanism. We're trying to go post-human. We're trying to go post-scarcity. We're trying to go post-ideology, transcend all these things, transcend ideology. And we need things like cognitive enhancements in order to get our head around it. I mean, the Ben Zion 2020 campaign is lifespan heavy, so they're super longevity heavy. They've got Ben Zion, who's a longevity advocate. Longevity is closer than you think. And then also Charlie Cam, who you would know, who everybody knows. He's a very famous person who's done A Transcendent Man. He's done a bunch of music videos, which are all incredibly good. I'm a singularitarian. I'm the very model of a singularitarian. I mean, this guy's great, but he's also a super longevity advocate. And so we do have super longevity right there at the core, and that's good for the United States Transhumanist-Party, because they're putting science, health, and technology front and center of American politics, or global politics too, in a sort of way, getting that global consciousness out there. But yeah, we've got the super longevity covered, but we also have all these other topics as well, including cognitive enhancements, and that ties in a little bit with super longevity, but not 100%. I mean, it's its own thing. It's more to do with super intelligence. So you're interested in cognitive stuff. Tell us more about cognitive enhancements and what you like to see from them and all that sort of stuff.
Right, that's a great question, Steele. So in terms of cognitive enhancements, well, there's so many, but one in particular, and I'm sure many people in the audience here have played a video game called Deus Ex: Human Revolution. Maybe you have as well. I would say that this game changed my life. I do not say that lightly. There's an enhancement. So this video game gives us a glimpse of what the future could be, good and bad, right? But one enhancement in particular that really just speaks to me is it's called CASE, Cognitive Computer Assisted Social Interaction Enhancer. In a sense, this augmentation, this enhancement, allows the user to gain a better understanding of the other person's viewpoint, where the other person's coming from, and in a sense allows them to exhibit greater levels of understanding and empathy, EQ, as it were. We keep hearing about how important EQ is. Well, an enhancement like this would be a tremendous way to boost anyone's EQ. Further, it would be an incredible way to treat autism or cure it altogether. And I think enhancements such as these would go a long way in terms of not just curing something like autism, but improving human relationships. Imagine if you could right away gain a better understanding of your spouse's point of view, right? Or a friend or a coworker. Imagine what you could do in terms of resolving conflicts, right? So I always say human relationships are very complex and sometimes very messy, unfortunately. This would go a long way in terms of improving relationships. So just any enhancements such as this, I think would be huge for humanity. Because let's face it, a great part of our life is interacting with other humans. Imagine what this could do for us.
I haven't actually played that game, and I'm pretty sure, like you said, a lot of the audience probably has, and that's great. And if you have, throw in the comment section what you thought about that game and what you thought about this technology. But I could think about this technology because it reminds me of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I've read and seen, and there was an emotional technology in there where it was made by some corporation, a corporation of women or something and they were sick of being mistreated by men, so they would shoot their husbands, who would then understand all of like, you know, they have to do all the washing and cleaning and cooking and drying it, and why they get emotional, and they shoot the husband, and then the husband feels a wave of emotions that it's a perspective changing enhancer as well. So I can think about that in the context of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but I'm sure it's very good in that game. And drop in the comments, what you thought of that as well. But yeah, that's great, and you're right. It's almost like, I study geopolitics. I like countries. I mean, if you could do it to a whole country, so a whole country could see a perspective of another country, I mean, that would be, because I'm not sure, countries feel like they have their own emotional states sometimes. And, America or China or one of these superpowers, if they could see from another country's perspective, how they look at the world and how the world looks at them, maybe they would change their behavior. Or if we could do it to a politician within that country, or beam Congress or something, so that they all go, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this because it's going to negatively affect those people, and actually those people are gonna. So it's a fun technology to think about, and if you could, there could be good implications for that in a security and ethical context, especially when power and money is concerned. And money is another one too. If you could zap a banker every now and again, I'm sure people wouldn't take that one amiss, or some of these financial guys who, steal money off grandmas or something. I mean, if you could zap one of these guys, you could, I reckon that it could be almost a worse punishment than a prison sentence in some cases. Cause in some cases it's a 5-year term or a zap,
right.
I don't know which one's worse sometimes. It's a very fun thing to play with. And so that's out of a video game. Yeah.
Indeed. But look, it could be used in not necessarily a good way. I'll give you an example. Knowing what the other person's thinking, well, that gives you some sort of advantage. But I do believe that the vast majority of people, if they did have such an augmentation or an enhancement, they would use it for good. Because I generally believe people are good, and things happen to one during their life that, my personal belief is, just like Confucius said way back when, and I study Confucianism, and basically Confucius believed that people are generally good. They're born good. They're not born sinners. They're born good, and everyone has the capability to be good. They just got to be on the right path. They've got to have the correct instruction and good role models and good education and so forth. He really believed that education was a huge key, as I do. And so I believe that people are generally good. And if we show them what's possible with technology, right, in terms of improving human relationships, in terms of curing disease, in terms of alleviating poverty, I believe there could be a tremendous amount of good done in the world currently. And there is currently a lot of good in the world, right? But if we watch the news, we're treated to these doomsday scenarios and all sorts of negative stuff. But there really is a lot of good happening in the world if we would only look for it. It's there. And I believe we can build on this. And technology has a huge potential to make the world a better place, improve human relationships, and improve the quality of life by improving the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. Confucianism is a very interesting thing to study. It's impacted a lot of people. China has had that running through its system for centuries, if not millennia. I'm not sure which one.
Correct. Yes, thousands of years. Absolutely.
Yeah, millennia. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So obviously it's impacted a lot of people, and they still have it today. So it can't exactly be that bad. In a certain context. I mean, China's a very old civilization. That's what you have to understand about China. Is China's very old. It's very big, and it's very complicated. And it's very Confucian, and it has been very Confucian for a long time. And for the most part, it's been a very closed society as well, which is kind of interesting. I mean, they've had a lot of internal conflicts and wars, but not terribly large expansionist periods for the amount of population.
No,
you'd think.
Never. Right. Yes, and that's a good point you bring up. China was a huge empire, right? But not in the sense that the United States or the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, right? The Netherlands. So what we've seen in history with the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, the United Kingdom, the United States is these powers seem to expand outward, right? Whereas China and of course India as well, they didn't do that to that extent. And if we study Chinese history, we don't see any sort of parallels with the United States in terms of exporting their politics or their way of life, right? And I know this has been talked about a lot, but the Chinese characters for China, 中国 means Middle Kingdom. And so the thinking is that, well, we're the Middle Kingdom, right? We already have everything, so why would we necessarily need to go out and to proselytize, as it were? And indeed, in studying Chinese history, you don't see any sort of, you don't see colonial behavior, right, in China's history.
Like, for example, when you look at a world map, I mean, usually Europe was at the center of the world map and everybody else was centered around, you know, Europe, for example. That was on all, that's pretty standard on world maps. Or it's Greenwich Mean Time, where the time starts and ends, you know, through the United Kingdom somewhere, and everybody else focuses around this. Apart from, I mean, they built a huge wall. I mean, they built the Great Wall. It's to keep people out and to keep the people in. I mean, Tibet is arguably probably the only the real one you can really talk about. You've got some Vietnam things, but it's nothing in terms of you know, European colonial policy, which has always been a global sort of ambition, always beyond their borders, and it's usually tied to ships and ports and in search of new goods and things. The Chinese in the 14th or 13th or 14th century sent their big treasure ships out. They had a look around. They abandoned that policy and they said, "Oh, we're going home." They brought elephants back and everything, and they said, "No, we're not interested. We're gonna sit back in Beijing and hang out there and do whatever they do in Beijing," you know, and you know, that's just how they've been for a long time. They didn't even go up to Siberia, which is just right there. I mean, it's just right there. And Russia creeped across and took all that land. So yeah, it's really interesting. Thing about Confucian values as well is ritual. You know, in Christianity, you have. You mentioned something interesting. You said, you know, that people are born; they're not born sinners, and that's a sort of a Judeo-Christian Islamic idea where you're born into sin and you have to accept the right deity or the right entity or whatever, and then you can transgress your sins. You can be forgiven of your sins if you accept Jesus Christ, for example, and your sins are washed away and everything's okay because you're born into sin. And it's that idea of eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden. You know, you expand on this point that we're not born sinners, and that, you know, and that we actually are inherently good and we can be shaped and molded into a value system and a moral system.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That is a big part of Confucianism. As I mentioned previously, Confucius believed that people are generally born good, and how they end up is largely a result of contextual factors, such as the upbringing they had, the education they had, the path they were on. And let me just give you an example of Confucianism in action, all right? If you've been to Japan or China or Korea or any one of those Confucian nations, and mind you, this happens in other countries too. So it's not just limited to Japan and China. But I'll give you an example in Tokyo, right? You're boarding an escalator to go to take a train, to go to the subway. There are automated announcements letting you know that you should stand a certain way. Well, you know, people are going to pass on the left, so you should stand on the right. And when you're on the train, it instructs you to have good manners, not speak loudly on your phone. This is very Confucian, right? And because Confucius believed that everyone is capable of being good, they just need the correct education and then to be given a good example. This happens in China as well. This happens in Taiwan as well, Singapore. Any one of these nations, if you go there, you will see Confucianism in action in that way, and in many other ways too.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting in China, because you don't only run into Confucianism and Confucian values, and in these other ones as well. So it's Korea. Korea is a different one because it hasn't always been North and South Korea. It's usually been the Korean kingdoms. It's just kind of a little bit different. These North-South Korean is a very modern institution, political structure. But yeah, you also end up feng shui as well, which is all about energy and harmony. And they build their buildings in funny ways that, you know, that that go with energy flows, mystical energy flows, or real energy. I don't know, but there's these energy flows that go through the cities and all this sort of stuff as well. So it's feng shui and it's Confucian values, piety, humanness, and ritual. Why these ideas of piety, humanness? Humanness sounds very good. There's a lot of humans in those countries. Not always,
Yes.
but it's always been a populated. India and China have always been the mega populated place, and not talked about in the West eternally, because Alexander the Great got to India. He invaded a little bit of India. He hit some elephants and stuff, and then the army cracked and they went back to Babylon. They did it about face. They didn't really cross the river. Not many people have tried to. There's not that many people who've tried to attack and enter India. It's a very big and old civilization with its own Hindu values, and Buddhism is massive influence. China is the same. They've both been big populated countries, non-expansionist in the most part. But why piety, humanness, and ritual? What's so important about this? Because I know Confucian wasn't just a philosopher; he's an astute political advisor as well. Why these ideas?
Indeed. So that's a really great point there. I believe, based on what I've read, that at some point Confucius became really frustrated with how things were going on there politically. You have to realize at the time there was really a lot of instability in China. And I believe at some point he became just really frustrated with the state of affairs there politically. And he began writing more. He began the more sort of philosophical journey that he took, right? And so you mentioned a few points there. So you talked about piety, humanness. I believe, and mind you, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert philosopher, but I've read quite a bit of philosophy, Eastern and Western. And I would say of everything I've read, in my opinion, Confucianism is the most, well, how I wouldn't want to say humane, but it's really a lot of focus on humanity, on the human experience, human condition, as it were. And you mentioned rituals. So China, being a civilization state, right, as opposed to the U.S., which is a nation state, right, or Germany, which is a nation state. And I think that's really one of the biggest differences between China and a lot of countries in the West. Western countries are typically nation states, and China's not a nation state. Well, it is a nation state, but only recently. And but for most of its history, it's been a civilization state. And invariably, when you have that much history over such a long time, you develop rituals, right? And of course, some of them good, some of them not. But another thing that's really big in Confucianism that I believe most people misunderstand. So there's a sort of people consider it some sort of social hierarchy. It's not really a social hierarchy. I'll just give you an example. Another real-life example in China and Japan, and I imagine Korea. I say China and Japan because I've lived in both countries, and so I'm familiar with both. I've never lived in Korea, unfortunately. There's a relationship between let's say the company you work at, right? There's a relationship between yourself and your manager. And some people think that it's a one-way relationship in which your manager tells you what to do and you do it. But that's not really accurate. It's a two-way relationship. So your manager takes care of you, right? So maybe your manager might instruct you to do certain things, but your manager is also responsible for taking care of you. The same thing happens between a husband and a wife, and this is kind of a controversial thing, but there's some people who are opposed to Confucianism because they believe that this philosophy hasn't been fair to women, and there's some truth to that. I will just say that right now. However, in Confucianism, though, the head of the family, right, has a responsibility to take care of the family. So it's not a one-way street in which the head of the family barks commands to everyone else, but the head of the family, whoever it might be, is responsible for taking care of the family. Additionally, if we look at China, we see a very large number of women who are very successful business people, and women hold a very important position in Chinese society. Even Mao Zedong famously said, "Women hold up one half of the sky." And even if you don't agree with his philosophies, and obviously the Cultural Revolution was terrible, and so was a great leap forward. And even currently today, the government acknowledges that it was an unmitigated disaster. Quote, one has to, if one looks at China, one will see that there are a great number of women who hold very important positions, and not just in society, but also in business.
You mentioned a very interesting phrase there. You said, whoever that might be. And I was thinking, well, that's a very interesting statement, because in Confucian times and moving forward, and the Chinese are a sophisticated people. They're the first ones with gunpowder. They were the first ones with a real degree of writing, you know, other than like the Egyptians were doing, mucking around with hieroglyphics. These guys were, you know, calligraphy. And also They had paper, and they had wheelbarrows. I mean, these guys were inventors. They were sophisticated people. And you said, you know, whoever that might be. And that's because the death rate in ancient civilization, regardless of what part of the world was quite, the turnover was quite high. And men, especially, even you know, building walls, building projects, and all that. There's no safety. The mortality rate of males is in all civilizations, including China, was quite high. So you say
that's correct.
A very interesting statement, saying whoever that might be, and that was because either the mother or the children would have to subsume the role of head of the household, because the male, the person in control and or whatever, was probably tipped to be dead by 25, by 35, by 40 at max, right?
Yeah, so I think you bring a very interesting historical topic. Yeah, and again, that's one of the things, if we look at life today and see how much better it was than back then, right? Back then, a common cold would kill you, right? We won't even talk about these sort of large infrastructure projects during which people would invariably die. But going back to that, the female plays a very incredibly important part in Chinese culture, not just in the family. That's just one thing. But and I believe this has been the case throughout history. And the other thing is too that currently in modern Chinese society, the grandparents play an incredibly important role. We see in a lot of families where the parents, the mother and the father, for economic reasons, need to go to another city to provide a living for their family. And a lot of children are raised by their grandparents. I'm not going to comment on whether that's positive or negative, but we see that the family structure is incredibly important in China. And not just that, the sort of care and loving that a Chinese family, the fact that the family members show toward each other is really was just so impressive for me. I spent 5 years in China before moving back to the U.S. and of course I'd love to go back there again. But that was for me one of the biggest things, one of the biggest takeaways from being in China is just how important the family structure is, and the way they would take care of each other, the way they would love each other. It's a little bit different from what we're used to in the West. It may not necessarily be as physically affectionate as we're used to, but nonetheless, there's really a lot of love and empathy in a Chinese family. That was really impressive for me to see.
Yeah, and China is one of these in the modern era. China's one of these now basically a superpower from essentially almost a pre-agricultural society. They didn't go quite Cambodia, you know, this starting from nothing idea. this
Right.
age zero or whatever, but they were damn close to it, and they've come and they've done an about face, and they've gone up to almost a technocratic society now. Do you have anything to
Right.
comment in transhumanist terms on the encroaching sort of technocracy of China, all these facial recognition systems and
Right.
these social credit systems, and if you look sideways at the political establishment, you're going to get, what do you have anything to mention on that front?
Indeed, that's a great question. So, technology has the potential for great good. It can also be used in not so good ways. And I think one of the most important things is we've got to look at China and other such cultures not from a Western lens, but from their own lens, which is admittedly quite difficult. But if we look at countries like China, but perhaps also India, definitely Japan and Korea, they have a slightly different perspective of what things such as privacy mean. And so I would say, having lived in China and Japan, but especially in China, there's an incredible amount of change currently. And we're seeing a lot of really positive things done with technology. An example is I believe the bus and taxi fleet in Shenzhen in southern China is entirely electric. I haven't been to Shenzhen in I would say about 7 years, so a lot of change during that time, I'm sure. But so there's a lot of really positive stuff done in terms of climate change and so forth. But indeed, so technology has great potential for good. I'll give you another real life example. The camera technology. So I'm not quite sure about Australia, but in the US, there are not really a lot of traffic cameras, whereas there are in China. And what this has done is, in a sense, really improved traffic in China, improved the quality of driving, as it were, because listen, if in China, if you're going to be a reckless driver, you're going to pay for it, right? You're going to get ticketed, and with enough violations, you get your license taken away. And so this has really actually contributed to a better environment over there in terms of traffic. But on the other hand, some people might comment that, well, it's impinging upon my rights. Both sides have a good point.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. And and also, there's a lot of traffic over there. I mean, there's so much in Beijing, for example, or maybe Shenzhen. I don't know, but I know in Beijing they have odd even license plate days. You have to drive. If you don't drive your odd even license plate day, then you're going to get your car taken off you because they can't. They just simply can't. There's too much traffic for the network. It's just too many cars and stuff. And but you're right. And battery technology is coming up. Elon Musk is doing Tesla, but so are China, and they're doing their own versions of Tesla all over the place. And electric cars are proliferating in that country. In some ways, at a more speedy pace than the United States. A lot of eyes on Tesla, but yeah, as you said, it's already some huge advancements in electric vehicles in China, and simply the Western media. I think because it is a kind of a closed society, and we always have to peek in, and it is kind of a big society that we can't really wrap our heads around. I mean, you're in America. You can get your head around 350 million people over a vast continent, with Canada included, maybe. That's an additional 30. Whether that counts or not, I don't know. But if you add all that together, yeah, it's okay. But you're not even halfway to China's population and density.
Right.
And China's a huge country with jungle down here, snow up there, desert in the middle, the Himalayas over there, and then you're into Central Asia and Europeans just over there, and the Middle East. I mean, that's an incredibly complex terrain. That's an incredibly complex geography with all of your people basically saturated around the ocean, the Pacific Ocean area. It's a very complicated scenario, and so I think things just move there at such big numbers and big pace that we go, what? 40 million cars were doing this. There's 25 million people in this whole country. I mean, so
right.
It's just one of those mind-bogglingly big number thing that we just can't really get our heads around. So it's with the electric vehicles, for instance, huge changes, and yet underreported unless you're watching Bloomberg or something. And a lot of people watch Bloomberg, but and I encourage people to watch Bloomberg Technology and Bloomberg News or whatever. But it's just one of those. It just doesn't filter into the Facebook feed so much unless it's one of these robot gadgets, and then it's Japan. And Japan, people can get their heads around again. It's just a big metropolitan city, the whole country, it's interesting. Technology. So did you live in Japan, you say?
I did. I lived about 2.5 years in Japan, 1 year in Taiwan, 5 years in China.
Where did you live in Japan? Tokyo, Kyoto, or north?
Tokyo, right. Tokyo area.
Tokyo, yeah. Big city, right?
Yeah, quite big. And it just sort of continues and continues and continues, right? Bleeding over into Yokohama. You don't really see where one starts and one ends. So
yeah, just these arbitrary lines to actually just make it sort of look like there's different jurisdictional efforts and stuff. So tell us about that, because I called John Kurtz, who was a candidate. He's come back on the show a few times. We're talking about space. He went up to a MiG in space, and I called him the Alan Watts of the campaign. I'm sure you know what?
I think that's very accurate. Yes, and I am familiar with Alan Watts.
I hope so, because he sounds like Alan Watts is someone. When I need to translate any of those Asian Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, I go straight to Alan Watts, because he had that Christian fundamentalist upbringing, and he can convert it into a Western idea. And he was a pastor or something. He was a church person, and he knows very well the Christian doctrine like the back of his hand, and he can convert it into that Western mind and explain everything, all those philosophies, in a very succinct, very simple way. And that's what I appreciate about Alan Watts. It's not just because he's some philosophy hippie out there, but he very sophisticated mind in converting those very complicated ideas into a Western head. So tell us about your time in Tokyo. That sounds really exciting.
It was, actually, and I will have to say, before I went over there, that was my very first time in Asia. I hadn't even visited Asia, and I kind of just jumped in cold turkey, taking a job over there, not knowing what was going to happen. And originally I thought I'm just going to be there 1 year, but ended up being 2.5, almost 3 years. And I cherished every moment of it, even the difficult moments, which definitely were there. But I would say mostly it was really quite positive. And I think
Japan is not the same country as it was pre-American occupation, because what you've seen is a post-American occupation Japan. You've seen the anime, and you see the funny the cartoon culture, right? And they like all their cartoons and all that, and sophisticated language. But it's an American culture now. It's an American satrap. Did you notice any American influence, or too much American influence in that country?
That's just such a great question, Steele. So here's the thing about Japan and other Asian countries, Korea and China. So there is a large amount of American influence, in the sense that you see people wearing jeans and T-shirts, and they listen to rock and roll. And by the way, Japanese people love America, and they love American music and culture and so forth. But
baseball.
And they love baseball, correct. And just like Chinese love basketball. But so that's only on the surface level. Japan and China are not Western nations, and they never will be, even if we've seen a lot of sort of Western influences over there. Those countries are still very deep. So Japan's very deeply Japanese, China's very deeply Chinese, and I don't think that's going to change ever. And I think that's why I love that you brought up that question, because even though we see a lot of things, so listen, there's Pizza Hut, there's Domino's in China, there's McDonald's in Japan, and so forth. So we see a lot of American culture, but Japan is still very, very Japanese, and it's always going to be, even if they appreciate a lot of Western things.
Yeah, and they still hold on to the old traditions and all that. That's really good to see. Japan's a very interesting country. I have a lot to do with Japanese people myself in business and in life. We've actually got we've got some Japanese people staying with us at my home right now, and I just think,
oh, great.
They're really interesting people. And in my hometown, for example, when I was growing up, and before that, when Japan was really doing well in the 80s, when everyone thought it was the next superpower sort of thing, they would come in swarms, huge swarm, in buses after buses after buses to do tourism in my hometown, because it's a rainforest town, and they're really, it's a beautiful area. And they would just come in swarms, and and all of the airport was Japanese and everything. It's all changed to Chinese now. There hardly any Japanese planes anymore, if any, Air Tokyo or whatever, Air Japan or whatever. And but yeah, it's all Chinese now. But it's an interesting country. We had to learn Japanese at school because there was so much Japanese influence here in Australia. The Japanese.
Wow.
Japanese Australian relations are very strong. And security context, Canberra, Tokyo, Washington, conferences all the time about trans-Pacific security relationships, because Japan is just one of those linchpin countries in a security context for the United States in its Asia-Pacific strategy. So, and there's problems there with Okinawa and the basing arrangements, but that's just all over the world with the United States. But no, it's I'm glad to hear that. Did you play any pachinko?
No, I never managed to play pachinko. I was just never very interested in it, and to be quite honest, never really understood it. So, but I did do quite a bit of karaoke. So
good, yeah,
which I love to this day.
Good to hear. Yeah, karaoke it can be a really fun thing. It's not my thing, but it can be fun for a lot of people. So let's talk about some transhumanism. So why did you get into transhumanism? Because you went to Tokyo and you just saw a robot and you thought, I want to become a robot, or what?
I wish that would be some story, but I'm not quite sure when. All right, so for a long time, I've always been enamored with technology and the promise it holds for improving the human condition. But I would say, if there was a turning point, it probably was playing Deus Ex Human Revolution that really just got me into transhumanism. For those of you who've played the game, know that throughout the game, you're the main character, Adam Jensen. Throughout his exploration, in certain stages, you find ebooks in the game, and a few of them are directly about transhumanism. So transhumanism is mentioned in the game. Not just that, the lead designer, who is no longer with the company, unfortunately, Jonathan Jacques Belletet, he's quite a big transhumanism fan, and in fact, I believe he had posted once about I think somebody asked him what were some of his favorite transhumanism related books, and he posted a list, which was great. And so if I had to think of a turning point, it was probably Deus Ex Human Revolution. And it really just blew my mind, because just the game itself, it provides a sort of it's a transcendental look at humanity and what it could become. And besides just the really cool augmentations in the game, one of them is the Casey, the computer-assisted social interaction enhancer, among other things. Just the whole philosophy in the game was really just very, very deep for me, and I think that was really the turning point for me in terms of getting into transhumanism.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool games like I really want to play this game now, and if you can do me a favor, send me a link to this game, tell the people about this game or whatever, and let's get somebody who was involved in the process of making this game on the show. I mean, let's talk to them about the behind the scenes stuff, what went through their head. Hopefully, get the script writers or somebody. I mean, let's get them on the show and let's get into their heads and say, hey, I'll play the game myself if that's what I have to do. It sounds exciting. Anything to promote transhumanism. It sounds really good. Siri. Not Siri. Is it Siri? Halo. Halo, the game Halo, where you have the woman in your head, and she helps you and assists you as an advanced AI, super AI, or whatever, narrow AI, whatever she is. She seems like a super AI.
Right.
Is this the same thing as that? Some sort of advanced AI system, which, or is it that other thing where it's like the emotional swap?
Oh, you mean in the game? So there are AI characters in Deus Ex: Human Revolution and the sequel Deus Ex: Mankind Divided, but mostly you see it through the perspective of the main character. And not to give too much away, but the character you play as has a number of augmentations, and he seems to be one of those special people whose body does not reject these augmentations. And so it's just really interesting from that perspective. He didn't really choose to be augmented. I won't give away too much. He doesn't choose to be augmented, but he is. And he comes to terms with this throughout the series, which I think is really amazing in terms of character development. Specifically, if we were to be augmented in the same way, would it be a scenario in which we chose to be like that, we really wanted to be, or would it be maybe we chose to be, but then maybe sort of had second thoughts about it? So it presents a lot of philosophical quandaries, as it were.
Yeah, sounds really exciting, and I'd like to explore that notion because, for example, with gene editing, with in vitro fertilization and all the advancements over there, with growing babies, these new genetically modified babies and things, you're going to end up with minimum 3 parents, 5 parents, why not 100 parents, because you can take the best genes from all the different parents. And then if you have 100 parents, I mean, why would your body reject these augmentations? Because you have such a wide variety of parents and genes to choose from. I can see that in the future that, with CRISPR gene editing as well, CRISPR-Cas9, CRISPR-Cas13. I can see a future where eventually, if your body rejects it, you can just re-edit your genes so you don't reject it anymore. I mean, obviously there's some risks there, but that's what the future is all about. We're all about exploring the new options to eliminate those risks and to get it down to a science and to get it into your supermarket for $1, $1 or less.
Yeah, that would be something.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's a great point, mate. So I think CRISPR and gene editing and all these technologies are great. They hold a lot of promise, but I think on some level, though, they are really deeply concerning for large swaths of the population. That's understandable. Sometimes people will ask me, well, why do you identify so deeply with transhumanism? And I turn around and I ask this question to them. Wouldn't you like an additional 5 to 10 years of a healthy lifespan? And still, there's no sane person who would say no to that question. I'll ask another question. Think about babies who are born with or certain conditions, or a child with cystic fibrosis. don't you think curing this child and enabling this child to have a long, healthy life, don't you think that's what humanity is all about? This is the promise of transhumanism. It's not about becoming a machine. It's about becoming a better human being. And I think that's really the way we need to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about becoming a better human being, and that's exactly right. I mean, there's a lot of play in there, and that's why a lot of these transhumanists are libertarian on the spectrum. They identify as libertarian, whether they're socialist leaning or anarchist leaning. It doesn't matter political leanings to do with politics. Most of them believe in morphological freedom. This idea of morphological freedom, you can do with your own body, and we've talked about spent a good amount of time. The previous gentleman, he just mentioned that for clinical trials, for example, there's big problems there with clinical trials because of the samples and the demographics and the types of drugs and stuff. I mean, why can't terminally ill people decide to take trial medication, for example? You've got 4 months to live, and the doctor's saying, well, by the way, we have this trial medication, but the FDA didn't approve it yet. So, sorry about that. You're going to have to just pass away without trying this. But like he used an example, like this one girl, she was trying and went to Congress and went here and went there and went everywhere while she's about to pass out. And then just after she's gone, they say, oh, by the way, we've just passed it and it works perfectly. Oh, it's just a bit too late now, isn't it? Even though she was begging people. So, there's this idea of morphological freedom and identity and libertarian-esque ideas embedded within transhumanism, regardless of where people stand on the collectivist sort of political spectrum, whether they're Marxist or Keynesian or a Milton Friedmanite or whatever the economic or political theorem that they subscribe to. There's this really important idea. And this augmentation stuff you're talking about in this game is the same thing. I mean, nobody wants, like in Australia, I'll give you an example. In Australia, they've just passed legislation. It's called No Jab, No Play. And basically what it is if it's against these anti-vaxxers, and it's basically if you're an anti-vaxxer, you're entitled to not vax your children, but you're not entitled to the same scenario of services as children who have been vaccinated, because you're basically now exposing everyone else to a risk. So yes, you can not vaccinate your kids as your parental right, but you can't let your kid then go and infect everyone in the playground, with an unvaccinated kid. What do you think about this sort of policy? Because it's the same thing with vaccines. I mean, people, you've got pockets in America, because you've got these bloody anti-vaxxer people. You've got pockets of medieval diseases that I never even heard of, all popping up all over the place because some smart person decided that vaccines were a bad idea.
Yeah, Steele, listen, it's despite what we may feel about it, I think it's a really complex issue. You're talking about things, not just science, but about health, about parenting, and it's difficult for me to read and hear about this because I'm a parent, right? And in my viewpoint, I'd like to do everything in my power to ensure that my children are healthy and happy and are able to live a dignified life, not a perfect life, because there's no such thing as perfect, but a dignified life. And when these scenarios occur, for instance, a parent choosing to not vaccinate their children, and then these children in turn become a risk to society. This is a very complex issue. And while I do feel that no one should be allowed to put others at risk unnecessarily, this is something where, listen, we've got to get people at a table and to discuss it like adults. But I think that we should draw a line when people are very negatively It's a scenario in which it's a really big risk to the health and longevity of other people. I think we've got to draw a line there.
Yeah, and there are certain scenarios where vaccines will like damage a kid or something like that, and like, you know, because they have other problems, and if they take the vaccine they'll get sicker, and maybe you don't need a vaccine. For example, I've never taken a flu shot because a flu shot always vaccinates you, or it prevents last year's flu, but by the time that you take the shot, it's the flu is probably already changed. Flus are very flexible like that. So what's the point of taking a flu shot over last year's flu when it's probably evolved since then? So, you know, I don't do that, because, and also it's expensive in this country. It's quite expensive, and it's hardly effective because the flu is always evolving, and they only can do it of last year's flu. So, for example, there's no point in doing that. You can do that if you want, if you're afraid of last year's flu or something. And there's no problem with that. And there are certain exceptions to the rule, but you know, when you get these screaming talking heads on the radio who have no scientific background, they don't really know, it's all for maybe a religious reason or an Illuminati thing, or it's a
Illuminati thing.
You know, it's a top-down depopulation conspiracy or something, when obviously that can't even be, because, you know, isn't that supposed to happen in the 90s? Or, you know, it's always around the corner. It's some sort of, you know, so those type of arguments are very annoying, and those are the type of arguments that I don't enjoy. But there are certain, like you said, there are adult topics and there are adult ways to sort it out, and there are always circumstances and exceptions to any rule, usually, except for gravity or something. But I mean, even inside a black hole, you get a bit of a weird gravity complex, so maybe there's even exceptions to the rule there. But yeah, no, totally agree. It's a complex issue about ethics and parenting and you know, conceptions of life and stuff like that. But as an objective national health experiment, I mean, medieval viruses gone, medieval viruses coming back, not good, right?
Not good, definitely not good. And I think we've always got to look at the science. We've always got to look at the numbers before we make any sort of decision. But old diseases coming back, we can't stand for that. We've got to not only eradicate those, we've got to eradicate the existing ones too, right? And we're not going to stop until they're all eradicated, because all of those negatively impact each person. They negatively impact the quality of life, not to mention the lifespan. So definitely.
Yeah, and transhumanism is all about, like you said yourself, it's all about health span, lifespan, you know, and it's you know, it's like, it's kind of interesting, because if you ask someone who's, you know, who's 20 years old, and you say to that 20-year-old, oh, do you want to live till you're 90? And they say, I'll just cut my life at 70 because, you know, life will be, you know, be too old and decrepit by then. Why live to 90? You get to 70 and you say, oh, you want to live to 90 years old? And they say, I want to live to 150, you know? And when you get to 90, you're saying, do you want to live to 91? And they're saying, hell yeah, I want to live to 91. Like, you change your mind over time. You come to appreciate life more. You understand more about the preciousness and finitude of life, and life becomes more precious. And you want to enjoy more of it as you get older. And I think you know, there's been certain. And I like that you study Confucianism, because I think in the West there's been and the 20th century was a big experiment. Like, 20th century was a big experiment, a political experiment for a lot of bad ideas. I mean, you're talking about fascism and racism and eugenics, and you're talking about communism, Marxism, you know, Bolshevik revolutions. You're talking about proxy wars for superpowers and very new, you know, atomic weapons and chemical. The 20th century was a mad century. I mean, that it's amazing we scraped through that. I mean, just by the hair of our chinny chin chin, right? And we don't want to go. We want to learn the lessons and say, okay, well, yeah, that did happen, but yeah, we remember that, and we improved from that, and we went forward from that, and said we don't want to repeat those bad scenarios again, and we don't want to go back there again and do that again, and learn from those, right? We want to improve on life. I mean, otherwise, what's the point if we go back to because the weapons and stuff are only worse now. I mean, it's only
Correct.
It's only going to be more hellish. I mean, what's the point of going back in time? Isn't it all about self-improvement, spiritual improvement? This is why I like that you study Confucianism, because I think the West, because these empires, they blowed up very quickly and they sort of crashed pretty quickly, and I feel like the West has a little less value on life. I mean, capitalism sort of came out of the West, and not saying capitalism bad, I'm a capitalist, but sort of life is a little bit more harsh, right? In the West, it's a little bit more processed, it's a little bit more manufactured, it's a little bit more, we put values on anything. It's a financial. Everything has a name. You know, if we see something, we go, oh, we got to write it in our book and inscribe it and detail it and picture it. And I'm not saying any of that's bad. I'm not saying, but life is quite harsh, right? And it's not always the best approach to life. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's a lot of points there, and that's really fascinating. So I'm of the opinion that we should take anything useful we can from any society and any culture in any part of the world, if it helps us to improve the human condition. Now, whether it's from the East or whether it's from the West, and there's a lot of positive stuff coming out of the West, and there's a lot of positive stuff coming from the East. And similarly, there's a lot of negative from the West and a lot of negative from the East. So I think we've got to look at, the way I personally look at things is, I'm not really concerned about a certain political view, or whether someone's a capitalist or they're not a capitalist. I care about if someone's a good human being. That's really the way. That's basically how I look at it. And whatever we can do to improve the human condition, I'm generally in favor of. And especially with science, science and technology have a tremendous potential for good. They've also got potential for, unfortunately, for evil if we use them in the wrong way. So I think what we have to do, we really owe it to ourselves and society and the world to use science and technology for the betterment of humanity, for improving the human condition. Now, whether that happens in the East or happens in the West or happens in the North or happens in the South, I don't really care as long as it happens. And when I look at someone, I like to look at them as not whether, if this person's from the West or the East. I look at them as what sort of human being they are, and I try to look at what can I learn from this person. More importantly, though, what sort of human experience could I have with this person? So currently, Steele, on this show, you and I are having a human experience, sharing our viewpoints, connecting on deep levels, and whoever's watching this show is also participating in this in one way or the other. This is all a human experience. Everything we're doing right now is a human experience.
Yeah, totally agree. And you're part of what I call the post-Earthrise people. You know, we had the famous, you know, the ship, the spaceship went up there. It took the photo of the planet, and everybody sort of went into this collective post-trauma where they, you know, there's been Chinese people, and the Greeks were trying to say it with pi, and Galileo was trying to say it, and people have been trying to say that the Earth is round and is floating in space for a long time. But when an actual photo came back down, that's something people point to and go, now I see. Now I see the finitude of it. And, you know, you're right. We could go into the Islamic golden age where science and technology proliferated and then died off, and then it went to Europe. We could talk about Sir Francis Bacon. We could talk about the Chinese innovations, or the Hindi and Indian innovations, or the innovations in Russia or Africa. But actually what it comes down to is what you're trying to point out is post-Earthrise, we realize, actually it's all human innovations dimensions, and all of this bubble of mass here, all the little complexities of sailing here, sailing there, information transfer, eating, sleeping, doing daily life, having all these, it all ends up as a human collection and a human experience, all on this tiny little floating, what's Carl Sagan call it? Blue speck or something,
The speck of dust, or
yeah, some speck of dust in the middle of the middle of the galactic infinite, right? So it's kind of like, oh, okay, I get the game now. Yeah, we might as well all work together, because if we don't work together, it's essentially a prison planet, and we're not going to get to go and look at all the other cool stuff that's out there, and explore all the other stars and galaxies, and also the small, the nano, and in our heads. Our heads are an amazing. You're talking about neuroscience. That's one of the most amazing complex machines, I think, even ever, because even if we do invent a supercomputer, we invented the supercomputer, and who's cooler, the supercomputer or the thing that invents the supercomputer? And if we were genetically engineered by aliens, or if God made us, I guess that trumps it. But that's it. Like, it's as far as it goes. If we're just some ape creature that just happened to be here, I mean, that makes us the winner in that arena of complexity. It doesn't make us superior to anything else or anything like that. I don't think it's a superiority, a hierarchical argument. I disagree with this notion that it's a pyramid and it's people up here and it's then it's the sea creatures and down here and the mammals. I disagree with that. I just see a circle, a symbiotic relationship, and that's why we talk about the environment a lot on this program, and that's why we have environmental people on all the time, because we have to protect the environment. We've destroyed most of the environment. Now we've got to turn around and we've got to protect it for our own sake. And if you agree with human expansion, human development, human health span, lifespan, and I like that you mentioned that China is making significant progress on the environment. They've been forced into a corner because they had to undergo at a rapid pace the dirty development phase that took the West about 200 years or more. They did it in 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or whatever. They did it in a really, really short time, but it was super dirty. And one of the things, TAF's down here, one of the people we support here, TAF's the Transdisciplinary Agora for Future Discussions. It's an American corporation, but it has a massive African influence. And we want, for example, Africa to skip its development curve of that dirty industrial development curve, which you would have seen. You would have seen the face masks. You would have seen the pollution. You would have seen the dirty rivers. You would have seen the abuse of fish and fish markets, and you would have seen some of the dirty side of that environment. And we can skip that. And if you think about a post-Earthrise community, global community, doesn't have to be a global government. I'm not advocating a global government, never have advocated a global government, but a global human community. Absolutely. We could skip that, and we could have a much better relationship with the world, and therefore build a better relationships with ourselves, and then come up with some of these ethical, moral, philosophical parameters, and which we need in order to direct this AI so that we have a positive singularity. Because if we don't, we're not going to have a positive singularity. We're going to have a basilisk, Rocco's basilisk. And I tell you what, I might be on the right side of that, but I tell you what, for whoever's not, I mean, goodness help them.
Yeah, that's so very true. Listen, technology will evolve. The world will evolve. But unless we ensure that it evolves in a way that's consistent with our beliefs and value system, we might not be very happy with the outcome. And so that's the reason why I always urge people, the projects they're involved in, to really assess what's the good that's going to come out of this. How is this, besides the bottom line? You've got to have the bottom line, right? A business has to make money. End of story. But how is this serving in some way the public good? How is this delivering value for humanity? It's really very important for me. Another thing that's very important for me is, does this help people live a more dignified life? Dignity is very important for me. Without dignity, you cannot have, there's no quality of life, right? Humans have to have, it's a very essential part of the human experience, dignity. And if whatever we develop, be it a business or artificial intelligence, we've got to make sure it develops in such a way that it serves humanity, right? It serves the goal of humanity and serves the goal of the planet. If we lose the planet, we've really got nothing else, right? It's not a scenario in which other planets are currently inhabitable. So we really can't destroy the one we have now. We've got to treasure the one we have now, as well as develop other ones if possible. So it's not an either or scenario, right? It's a both and scenario, in my view.
Yeah, very powerful statement. Not an either or, it's a both and I totally agree. It's I want to get more inventors and entrepreneurs on. I'm having Dr. Catherine on. She's from CERN. She's an inventor. And, she's made me really ponder and think about the role of the inventor. That's hard. That's coming up with a technology or an innovation, a device or something along those lines that nobody else has thought of in order to enhance and solve problems. And that is hard. I mean, that is hard. I mean, with all the life pressures, and that's why we have a special place in our hearts for inventors, Leonardo da Vinci or, Tesla or whoever. I mean, we have a special place in our hearts and minds for inventors because these people, there's a lot of philosophers out there and they sit around and they sort of philosophize and they say this, but it's actually really hard to convert those sorts of mind energy into something tangible and workable that can enhance, the steam engine, these components here that make a steam engine go around. I mean, it seems so simple, a zip. It seems so simple. It's so important. Right. It's so effective. The buttons, how you maneuver a button or a pen with ink or, and then you get into way more sophisticated technology, audio equipment, visual sound, broadband technology, but something as simple as a comb, this is amazing. I'm amazed all the time. And I look around and I look at technology all the time and I think, wow, this is, someone's designed it, built it, it's fulfilled a need, and then it's commercially viable where they've actually mounted the product and promoted the product to get out there. I mean, there's some absolute rubbish, but that stuff doesn't survive. I mean, no one really remembers that. I mean, people remember the good stuff, and humans go through these phases where they do produce a lot of rubbish, and that's just a phase where they go through is when markets open up or something, but this amount of incredible technology, and you can go into cars, people are fascinated by cars. I mean, I've never bothered to own a car, but people are fascinated by cars. I mean, when I watch Top Gear, I mean, that's pretty cool. Like, there's a lot of cool, interesting cars out there and cool, interesting motorbikes, and people are always innovating in that sector. There's a lot of really, really interesting, cool technology, and inventors and entrepreneurs fulfill a very, very vital pseudo-spiritual, practical role. They fit this very interesting nook in the intellectual space, and they're very exciting people, and I'm very excited to have more of them on. Do you know many inventors?
I know a few, and I would agree with you. I've got a tremendous amount of respect for people who build something from nothing, whatever that might be. A lot of the things we have right now that we take for granted, such as you just showed a comb, but back when it was invented, that was huge, right? So were things like, obviously, like a mouse. The mouse I'm using to move this cursor around, or this audio video technology that's allowing us to be speaking with each other right now. from thousands of miles away. I think that's huge. We just take it for granted right now because it's commonplace. But when it came out, it really was just paradigm shifting, right?
Yeah, and it's only 2020 now, and I still remember broadband dial-up, the old phone going diddle-diddle-diddle,
Right.
It's only 20 years, and now it's it's going to be ubiquitous with this Starlink technology, where like we were saying with I'm not sure if it was this show or last show, but the technology with the Internet of Things coming around the corner, information technology is going to be ubiquitous within society. You're going to be able to go out in the Pacific Ocean in the furthest reaches. Castaway, you seen the movie? He's gonna crash on the island, right, and it's going to be over in 10 minutes because he's going to get his waterproof phone out. He's going to look it up. He's going to put his spare battery in. He's going to call them and say, "Oh, I'm in the middle of the ocean.
Right.
Here's my Google Maps.
Right.
Thanks very much." And you'll sit on Facebook, and then there comes the aircraft, and it's the movie's over. I mean, the movie's over.
Right.
And he won't lose his wife and all. There's no drama anymore. I mean, no more Castaway. So, in a sense, that's good. In a sense, no more Castaway movies. So, it'll have to move to space movies where they're out of right, range of the giant thing, and there's no satellites in the air. But Earth will be conquered in that way. So that's super exciting in some ways. That this information will become sort of ubiquitous throughout society. This information technology, this Wi-Fi, and all this other stuff. Technology is absolutely really, really cool. I mean, it's cool, and it's happening, and we want to promote it, and we want to discuss the ethical implications of the technology as well. You mentioned, by the way, you have an interest in engineering. Tell us about engineering. What is engineering? And what type of interest do you have? Do you want to build bridges, or do you want to do something really different?
That's a great question, Steele. So to me, engineering is building something from nothing, building something that wasn't there before. And if I'm honest with myself, obviously, these huge infrastructure projects are so impressive. They're so massive in scale. I've got a tremendous amount of respect for the people who are involved in such projects. However, my interest in engineering, right, and in science, besides my interest in longevity, which is so very crucial. Another area I'm really interested in is neuroscience, as we've discussed briefly, just because it affects so many aspects of the human condition. Look at conditions such as dementia, or depression, or Parkinson's disease, or stroke. All of those are associated with the nervous system in one way or another. And I think if we're able to develop technologies that help improve the human condition by treating and or curing such conditions, I think we can go a long way toward making or toward improving the quality of life dramatically for people. And so to me, it always leads me back to this part of medicine, which has always been more interesting to me than other areas. I mean, they're all interesting, don't get me wrong, but I always go back to this part of science and medicine because I believe it has, besides advancements in curing disease and reversing aging, it offers the most promise in terms of improving the human condition.
Yeah, and there's so many interesting engineering projects. I mean, you're talking about engineering of the mind. That's kind of really complicated. But just in the big engineering projects, Hoover Dam, Panama Canal,
right,
the pyramids of Egypt, the aqueducts of Rome, even the Roman roads. That spread all across Europe, a huge engineering project in itself. The Titanic, thinking about some sort of mechanical engineering project. The Great Railway that runs east-west or west-east across the United States. I mean, that's a huge marvel of engineering.
Three Gorges Dam.
Yeah, Three Gorges. That's huge. I mean, that's something that will stand the test of time. Hopefully, They'd dig that up in 10 million years, that one. So yeah, and then you get to the more sophisticated engineering projects, the Tesla cars, the solar cities, the SpaceX, the space shuttle, the Saturn V rocket, the Neuralace, the Neuralink, these engineering projects. It's getting smaller and more powerful. The internet, which is a global project, which spans these cables, these undersea cables across continents, whole continents. It's just amazing, right? And it's all engineering projects. It's all engineers are the most fascinating people because they solve problems. There's a problem. Information transfer. There's a problem. Depression. There's a problem. Getting to space. But they know sometimes solutions. Leonardo da Vinci was drawing helicopters. He knew that.
Right.
It's just the most amazing stuff. Or building the Zeppelin. Which is a transport problem, or pipeline, sewerage. These things. There's a problem, and engineers say, "Hey, let's develop a mechanical or a infrastructural solution." And I think you mentioned the human mind. I think they're approaching the human mind in the same way. There's a problem, Parkinson's disease. Let's fix it. There's a problem, depression, super happiness. There's a problem, and they're engineering the software, the tools, the mechanics, the probes, the nanos, the whatever, in order to fix and devise solutions to these problems from an engineering perspective, and it's just marvelous.
It is indeed, Steele, what we've been able to do through the years, but especially recently in the last few decades and centuries, has been nothing short of incredible. And I think we've got to continue on this. We've got to build upon this. By the way, I've got to log off soon, but I want to leave you and the viewers with these last thoughts for this show. Whatever your area of interest is, now whoever's watching this show, whatever your area of interest is, whether you're an engineer or a scientist or a physician or a journalist or a lawyer, whatever it is, if you're interested in improving the human condition, there's a way to do that. It's not necessarily related to some new engineering breakthrough which results in an IPO and massive wealth and fame. It's not really about that. It's about the daily work and passion that people are involved in together, collectively, that results in huge breakthroughs. It's not just someone sitting in their garage. Well, that's the stories we hear, right? This person was inspired, then they sat in their garage and they built this computer and so forth. But what we don't hear about is the collective work of many people, right, of different disciplines. I mean, how boring would the world be if it was just all engineers or all artists, right? And so I think it's an interdisciplinary approach in which a lot of different people come together in order to build something great. And no matter what area, no matter where you're from, what education you've had, what your interest is in, if what you're doing ends up benefiting humanity in some way, shape, or form, I believe that's noble. And I believe you should go forth with this.
Yeah, totally agree. That's really good. That's a really good point to leave us off on, because it's transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and I talk about this notion that it feels like we're swirling around near the end of history in the fact that the disciplines are slowly coming together. You can't talk about one thing anymore without having an impact on another person's field, and they're all starting to cross over, and they're all interlinked, and the conversations are all starting to sound the same. I mean, there used to be 20 years ago, 50 years ago, conversations in isolation. But now with globalism, with all these disciplines, they're all starting to swirl around the same talking points. It's coming down to the finish line. And if we get over the finish line, then we will have a better world, and we will have sorted out some of these problems, and we can go off and do some of these mega mind projects that we're thinking about as transhumanists. So absolutely, you have been fantastic, and I've really, really appreciated you coming on. Thank you so much for taking your time out of the day to come on to Detonation and to talk with me about transhumanism, about Confucianism, about engineering, about sorting out some of these global problems in the post-Earthrise society. It's been really fun. It's been great. I'd love to see you again here soon on Detonation. We'll keep talking, and we'll maybe bring somebody else on. We'll keep you updated with the Benzion 2020 campaign. Benzion's doing a fantastic, amazing job out there on the campaign trail. He's meeting politicians. He's doing a whole bunch of amazing stuff. So that's, keep it up, Ben. And Ben will be back on ASAP to do an update. He's in San Francisco, so that's really, really good. If you're in San Fran, go and see Ben. Remember to talk to me or talk to Ben about that. But you have been a great guest. Thank you very much for coming on. Is anything else you want to say before you go?
Well, I just like to offer my thanks to you, Steele, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to be on your show. And I'm very touched by your kind words, and I would very much love to be on your show again. Thanks very much indeed for the opportunity, and let's speak again soon.
All right, that's Arin. Arin, thank you from the United States of America, putting death out of business. Debt Nation.
Thank you.